Good morning, Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome at the fourth installment of the Václav Havel European Dialogues in Prague. The Václav Havel Library is proud to promote and advocate the legacy of one of the great Europeans, a major literary figure, a profound and provocative thinker, a defender of human rights, a prisoner of conscience, and finally the president of Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic. In organizing the European dialogues in Prague, but also in Brussels and other European capitals, we acknowledge our debt to all our partners and collaborators in this endeavor. In this case, the representation of the European Commission in Prague, the Sekira Group, our media partner, the Czech television, who are streaming this conference online to thousands of viewers around the country, our host, the Docs Center for Contemporary Art, all our speakers, including the fellows of the Václav Havel and Jiří Dinsbír Fellowship programs in journalism of the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and certainly not the least to you, the audience, without whom this conference would be a monologue rather than a dialogue. It is my pleasure to note that the concept of the Václav Havel European Dialogues has lost none of its relevance since its first conference in 2014. On the contrary, the need for a critical dialogue between and among Europeans of all kinds has increased dramatically due to some of the current European crises, setbacks, and uncertainties about what constitutes the European identity and what is the future of the continent. It is these uncertainties that are implicitly contained in the topic of this year's conference: where does Europe begin and end? It is a topic that is widely reflected in Havel's thinking, writing and speaking, and to which he had been returning time and again. In exploring the boundaries of Europe, he had in mind its physical borders as much as its geopolitical delimitation, but first and foremost, its spiritual definition as a body of values and ideas that coexists in the current world with other different bodies of values and ideas. On first sight, this line of thinking is somewhat unpromising, almost counterintuitive, considering how little the idea of Europe has changed over the millennia. Whether or not the etymology of the word can be traced to the ancient Semitic root denoting evening or the west, Arab in Phoenician, Erev or Mariv in Hebrew, the characteristic of Western has remained with Europe since ancient times. At the same time, and perhaps relevantly, the same root gave rise to the term Maghreb in Arabic, denoting an adjacent but separate part of the world. In the antiquity, Herodotus and others placed the western limits of Europe on the boundary between the continent and Africa, in the Pillars of Hercules at the Strait of Gibraltar, or a point close to there. At the same time, there was even then some uncertainty about the eastern border of Europe, with some placing it in the Caucasus, while others advocating a more restrictive definition of Europe, ending at the River Don. As we are all aware, some of this stayed with us to this day. Maybe more relevantly, since the Carolingian Renaissance of the 9th century, the term Europe has designated the sphere of influence of the Western Church, as opposed to both the Eastern Orthodox churches and to the Islamic world, suggesting both a geopolitical and spiritual divide, and standing at the root of many divisions and conflicts in the centuries that followed. It is a relevant question whether in the era of globalization these divisions are as relevant as they once were. One thing that is certain and should be kept in mind is that none of the definitions used to denote Europe makes it coincidental with the current European Union, a mistake often repeated even unwittingly by many of the European politicians. Although it is hard not to trace the Carolingian legacy in the setup and shape of the current EU as the core of the continent, the EU is not identical with Europe either in the geographical, geopolitical, and spiritual sense, except perhaps as a potentiality and a major challenge. It is also for this reason that I am so happy to see among the speakers at this conference Europeans from both within and outside the EU. In our quest to look for the borderlines of Europe, there is hardly a better place to start than with the words and ideas of Václav Havel. All his life, since he was 16, Havel had been preoccupied with the issues of European identity, European integration, and the meaning of Europe for the world and of the world for Europe. However, his was not just a verbal celebration of the European identity, but a critical, often painful examination not only of its wares, but also of its perils. And his critique often started with the question of borders, as when he wrote, quote, "Most wars in history have been wars of borders or territory. The lesson we can draw from this is that not only nation states, but even supranational communities should always be clearly aware where do they begin and where they end. Vague or contested borders are a frequent source of misfortune. This is something that the EU should keep in mind and be clear about its external borders." Mind you, this was written 23 years ago. If it wants to do away with borders, it must know first and foremost where it is really located. Written more than 20 years ago, the words sound a little prophetic. And Havel proceeded to provide a tentative answer to the question, an answer that may sound provocative to some of you. Where exactly, I quote, "where exactly is that border? In my view, it starts on the borderline between Russia and the Baltic states, runs along the frontier between Russia and Belarus and Russia and Ukraine, all the way to the Black Sea. It is evident from the map, and it holds also in the historical and cultural respect." Unquote. From Havel's point of view, the process of European integration remains unfinished as long as there are countries in Europe which meet the criteria for membership and desire to join but are unable to do so. And he wrote, quote, "Each new candidate for the membership in the EU must naturally meet all the common criteria. Nonetheless, once they meet them, no other consideration should lead to the postponement of their entry. As soon as it would become apparent that there are double standards at play, that there exists distrusts of the new democracies, fears that they will disproportionately benefit from the common budget, or a general fear of them as something new and difficult to comprehend, Europe will begin to fragment again, and this new fragmentation will soon become a much more serious concern than the novelty or the lack of table manners of today's post-communist democracies." Unquote. In defining Europe through its basic values, Havel did not significantly differ from the mainstream school of thinking, but thought it worthwhile to reiterate these values at every opportunity. And I will quote, "The fundamental European values, as they have developed in the turbulent spiritual and political history of the continent, are, I believe, clear. It is the respect for the unique human being, its liberties and dignity, the principle of solidarity, equality before the law and the rule of law, protection of all kinds of minorities, democratic institutions, the separation of the legislative, executive and judicial power, a plural political system, respect for private property, enterprise, and and market economy, as well as the development of the civil society. The current form of these values naturally also mirrors extensive European experience of recent times, the fact that our continent is becoming an important multicultural hub, unquote. But Havel did not rest in the complacent certainty of the noble European values. 17 years ago, he told the European Parliament, and I quote, "To reflect our European identity means more than just asking what set of values, ideals, or principles is contained in the concept of Europe. It also entails, by definition, a critical examination of that set of ideas, followed by the realization that many European traditions, principles, and values may be double-edged, and that some of them, if carried too far, exploited or abused in certain ways, may lead us to hell. The starting point is the cultural, spiritual, and civilizational definition of Europe. In a remarkable way, Europe is a space combining into a single historical stream many different influences, most importantly, the influence of the antiquity, Judaism, and Christianity. In comparison with a number of non-European civilizations, it has a number of specific features, the most characteristic being a new or different concept of time. In the European tradition, time, first as the history of salvation, and then time in the form of the idea of progress, is primarily an opportunity for or an appeal to movement, naturally meaning movement from the antiquated to the modern, from the inferior to the superior. People thrown into the European concept of time are tempted to believe that they understand the world with ever more depth and quality, and in the spirit of this knowledge, they feel duty-bound to keep improving the world and to spread their understanding and their recipes for a better life. They think of this knowledge as universal, and feeling universal responsibility, they feel entitled to spread their ideas and their progress all around the globe. As if the very substance of the European relationship toward the world contained germs of expansion. There is therefore something fatally ambiguous in the depth of the European spirit. On the one hand, the fantastic expansion of the rational knowledge, and as a result, the deepening of the respect towards the human beings and their rights, and on the other hand, the immanent expansionism. The typically European feeling of responsibility for the world eventually acquires, somewhat paradoxically, but in a way inescapably, the face of the proud owners of the truth, incapable of the elementary empathy with the world of the others, unquote. Havel's recipe for dealing with these dangers is, as many of his ideas, a paradox. In the same breath, he advocates the need for a deeper understanding of and respect for other cultures and traditions, and at the same time stresses the need for a clearer and specific self-definition of our own culture. And I will quote again, "Provided that humanity can cope with all the perils that it creates for itself, the world of the 21st century will be a world of an ever closer and equitable cooperation of large, often continental, and mostly supranational entities. To become such a world, the individual entities and the cultural and civilizational areas will have to be clearly aware of their own identities, to understand how they differ from each other, and to get used to the fact that their individual character is not a handicap, but only a specific contribution to the global wealth of mankind. However, the same tasks awaits those who have a tendency to consider their own individuality as the grounds for a feeling of superiority." Unquote. The ultimate challenge for Havel is thus the need to use the human power of self-reflection to stop what he believed is an inexorable process of our planetary civilization towards self-destruction. He attributed a large portion of the blame for this on Europe, and that is also why he felt Europe had a special responsibility in trying to reverse the course. And this will be my final quote. If it until recently sufficed that Europe, confronted with the threat of communism, defined itself simply as a space of human freedom, protection of human rights, and a guarantee of the growth of its civilization, it should now have become clear to everyone that communism was in fact only an opaque screen which could be and had to be opposed, but which at the same time was obscuring the most important reality that Europe must cope with, that is the contemporary planetary civilization as a whole, the civilization that Europe had stood at the base of and whose engine it had been for many centuries, but that had long since grown over its head and is hurtling forward by its own momentum to a place unknown. I believe that Europe cannot search for and find its idea in anything else than a new formulation of its approach to this planetary civilizational automotion, which it itself had once started. So, unquote. So this is Havel on the limits of Europe. We have a whole day ahead of us to discuss these and related questions. Before we do, however, I want to give the floor to our partner, Dana Kovaříková, the acting head of the European Commission representation in the Czech Republic, and then to my friend Jacques Rupnik, who stood at the start of the project of Václav Havel European Dialogues. Dana, please. Thank you.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning also from my part. And if you allow me, thank you. Sorry. And if you allow me, I will switch into another language, another official language of the European Union, which is Czech. Já bych chtěla v první řadě recipročně poděkovat panu Žantovskému a knihovně Václava Havla za pozvání a organizaci. Já si nesmírně vážím toho, že zastoupení Evropské komise v České republice může být partnerem a spojencem akce, která na jedné straně připomíná evropský odkaz Václava Havla a na straně druhé otevírá kvalitní diskusi o budoucím směřování evropské integrace. Tematicky i načasováním je dnešní událost velmi příhodná. Jak víme, v době, kdy si Evropská unie připomíná 60 let svých zakládajících římských smluv a jedna země se v referendu rozhodla ji opustit, stojí Evropská unie na křižovatce a rozhoduje se, kterou cestou se vydá dál. Tato celospolečenská reflexe o budoucnosti Evropy má mnoho podob a forem vyjádření, ať už formou konference, jako je ta dnešní, nebo například způsobem, jakým evropští občané volí své politické představitele. I toto je jedna z mnoha odpovědí na otázku, jakou Evropu chceme mít. Evropská komise, kterou zde zastupuji, do tohoto procesu též přispěla, a to takzvanou Bílou knihou o budoucnosti Evropy. Ta obsahuje úvahy a scénáře o tom, kterým směrem by se mohla vzájemná spolupráce 27 členských států vyvíjet. Bílá kniha a návazné diskusní dokumenty nastěňují způsob, jak se Evropa a svět změní v příštím desetiletí a navrhují různé cesty, kterými můžeme kolektivně reagovat. Cíl je hlavní nastartovat debatu na všech úrovních o tom, jakou Evropu vlastně chceme a co to konkrétně znamená. Já, když jsem se teď v rámci přípravy na tuto konferenci po nějaké době opět začetla do myšlenek prezidenta Václava Havla, tak mě znovu a zase ohromilo, jak nadčasové a aktuální jeho vize o fungování Evropské unie jsou. Já se zde nebudu pouštět do interpretací jeho úvah, to s velkou úctou přenechám jeho bývalým zde přítomným blízkým spolupracovníkům a přátelům. Nicméně jednu myšlenku bych si přece jen dovolila rozvést. Václav Havel ve vztahu české veřejnosti a politiky k Evropské unii poměrně razantně vystupoval proti onomu vnímání my versus oni. A já si v této souvislosti kladu otázku, jak by Václav Havel dnes reagoval na ten již dlouhodobý trend v českém veřejném diskurzu, kdy velice často na místo důležitých témat a racionálních úvah o významu našeho zapojení do integračního procesu přece jen stále ještě často dominují mýty, zkreslující polopravdy Třeba ona laciná karikatura fungování evropských institucí. Zde mám na mysli ono slavné Brusel přikázal, Brusel zakázal. Samozřejmě toto vnímání je pouze jedním z faktorů, které negativně ovlivňují důvěru občanů v Unii, která je momentálně v České republice, jak všichni víme, na velmi nízké úrovni, dokonce na historické minimum. A ty další faktory asi netřeba vyjmenovávat. Jsou jimi reálné problémy, reálné hrozby, nerealizace společně přijatých rozhodnutí, či například nástrahy informační společnosti. To vše a další také přispělo k rostoucí nedůvěře, jímž důsledkem je, že podpora evropského projektu již není tak silná jako dříve. My na zastoupení Evropské komise v České republice vnímáme toto jako náš hlavní úkol, a sice potřebu změnit toto odcizení, a proto se spolu s mými kolegy na každodenní bázi zaměřujeme na vyvracení mýtů a snažíme se pomoci překonávat ono uvažování o vzdáleném Bruselu. Rovněž se snažíme podněcovat debatu o důležitých tématech, která momentálně leží na stole evropských institucí a je třeba o nich teď přemýšlet, diskutovat a rozhodovat. Snažíme se v českém prostředí mimo jiné podporovat otevřený dialog o výzvách, kterým Unie čelí, a zároveň hledat odpovědi, jak těmto výzvám čelit společně a nikoliv rozděleně. A tato dnešní konference Evropské dialogy Václava Havla do tohoto schématu naprosto zapadá. Proto mi dovolte, coby zástupkyně Evropské komise, vám velmi poděkovat za to, že jste se zde sešli s cílem debatovat o evropských výzvách současnosti a o uspořádání Evropy v budoucnosti. Já si velmi vážím vašeho důstojného odkazu Václava Havla a na úplný závěr mi dovolte popřát nám všem, aby se nám společně dařilo rozvíjet a naplňovat jeho ideu nejen českého evropanství. Děkuji vám za pozornost.
Já jsem předtím jenom letmo zmínil našeho následujícího řečníka, protože vždycky mám dojem, že Jacques Rupnik nepotřebuje příliš představovat v Praze a v jejím okolí, ale měl bych pro pořádek dodat, že to je velmi respektovaný profesor politických věd, ředitel Centra pro mezinárodní studia a výzkum na Sciences Po v Paříži, profesor na College of Europe v Brugách, autor mnoha významných publikací, bývalý spolupracovník Václava Havla, a mohl bych pokračovat, ale můžu, jo? Tak pojď.
Dobrý den, dámy a pánové. Děkuji za vlídné uvedení a hned přejdu do angličtiny, protože je to přece náš pracovní jazyk. Good morning to all. Welcome to the fourth meeting. We have the Václav Havel Dialogues. When we started the dialogues, the common wisdom was in Europe that first the European questions are of little interest to the broader public. Public opinion is not interested. And that the European issues are of little relevance to domestic politics of member states. The second major question was, and I remember our meetings 2 years ago, was that the combination of external threats and of internal crisis of the European Union, the Eurozone crisis in particular, threatens not only to weaken Europe, but there were even questions about disintegration. I remember Ivan Krastev being here and, comparing possibilities of disintegration of the European Union with those of other empires of the past. And there is a third element that recently affected the context in which we are talking about Europe today. And that was, on one hand, the Brexit vote in Britain, the election of Donald Trump, not to mention Orbán and Kaczynski declaring the need for a counter-revolution in Europe, the idea that the nationalist, populist politics of closure are now threatening the very core of the European project. Well, the crisis is still there. The underlying causes of those crises are still there. But the two things, at least, deserve to be mentioned that have changed or that are changing. First of all, there is nothing irresistible about the rise of nationalism and of the Europhobic populism. We have seen in Austria, only narrowly, in Holland, more convincingly, and most recently with the presidential elections in France, that the pro-European liberal project can convincingly win in a democratic founding member of Europe. Interestingly, a candidate that has throughout in every speech talked about Europe. It's not that he dodged the issue. No, the issue was there. So, yes, all this points to the possibilities to rescue the European idea from the tide of populist nationalism. Secondly, the European question has become a salient issue in domestic politics. This is new as well. In member state countries, contrary to the situation 10, 20 years ago, this has now become a salient issue in domestic politics, and perhaps most importantly, after a long period when the European agendas were dominated by economics or financial issues, this is the return of politics at the center of the European agenda. On the 60th anniversary of the Rome Treaty, we can say we witnessed the return of politics. All three themes of this year's dialogues that we're going to be discussing today point to that direction. The return of geopolitics, this is the first theme. The EU, this is a paradox, has been built on the containment or even the repudiation of geopolitics. Geopolitics was excuse me for this, geopolitics had destroyed Europe on two occasions in the 20th century. Geopolitics being a, let's say, noble academic varnish on nationalist or expansionist projects. That's how it was understood. So the European project was built on the containment of geopolitics, and that project has been very successful in providing peace on the European continent. However, that success internally is now confronted with major geopolitical threats externally. In the East, we have seen with the Ukrainian crisis and the new Russian policies in its neighborhoods, and we have seen the southern flank, the collapse of states, the rise of the so-called Islamic State and the related issues of terrorism and migration, you have Europe confronted with the return of geopolitics. So this is the paradox. A project built on the repudiation of geopolitics is confronted with geopolitical challenges. Second theme we're going to be discussing, what are the limits of the EU integration project? In the 1990s, we had the debates deepening versus widening. That was one way of putting it. And eventually, we decided for both. Well, that was a success in some respect, but it was also creating new strains that we are confronted with today. So we really have on the agenda the geographical territorial limits of European influence. And that means not just about enlargement, because that is not on the immediate agenda, although it is very important for countries of the Balkans, for instance, to keep that prospect open. This is crucial if we want to consolidate the transformation of that region, but it is very important for the so-called neighborhood policy. So what are the possibilities, what are the limits of that influence? Clearly, Ukraine is a major question, major test, let's say, for European influence there. The second limit concerns how deep the integration should be. What are the democratic, political limits of that integration, which raises the question of sovereignty and the capacity to share sovereignty. So we have, this is a second issue. All these issues start with the Eurozone crisis, migration and borders, foreign and security policy, the state of democracy within the Union. This is, we've been discussing, what does the EU do to the democratic process? No, we have now serious problems with democracy within some of the member states. I've just been recently invited to give a lecture at the Central European University in Budapest. Well, this is a case study of what is happening inside the European Union. So all this brings us back to the return of politics, and it also brings us back to the question of the principles and values on which the European Union, the European project, is based. So that on one hand, and secondly, the external threats. For a shortcut, I would say Putin, the Islamist, in a different category, but also important challenge, the election of Donald Trump. All this helps to concentrate the minds, so to speak, for the Europeans in those terms. So we are in a new situation where what Jacques Delors described the Europe as an unidentified political project, well, that no longer will do today. We are therefore confronted not just with the question of identifying what that project is, but also reflecting about the difficulty of identification with the European project in democratic societies. So hopefully one helps the other. The success is by no means guaranteed, but to use Václav Havel's phrase, we have the responsibility to try. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jacques. I think this was a wonderful introduction to some of the topics and themes we will be discussing. I think it's only maybe proper that we started with a somewhat EU-centric perspective, and now we will try to broaden the picture with our first panel on the geopolitics of Europe. And to open the panel, we have a very distinguished speaker and a dear friend, Anna Palacio, who is also more than one thing. She's a former foreign minister of Spain, a former member of the Spanish Parliament, currently a member of the Council of State in Spain, former general counsel to the World Bank Group, and also a visiting professor at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Anna, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Michal. And it's a great pleasure. And really, it's an honor to be here because this is a symbolic place because of Václav Havel, and because these just dialogues at its 4th edition are just the place that you don't want to miss if you want to have a thorough discussion. Now, I was supposed to begin at 9:15. I'm not German, I'm Spanish, but I was supposed to begin at 9:15 and we were supposed to conclude by 9:45. So I turned to the master of ceremonies and I asked him where we are. Well, you know, it's always you are between a rock and a hard place, and this is my case. I honestly, after what Charles Rupnik had just said, I could say thank you and amen, because this is what I was going to say. This is exactly what it is. This is the moment of geopolitics. It's a moment of geopolitics internally and externally for Europe. And the core of it is the European Union. And besides, we have our neighborhood, be it south or be it east, that presents challenges. We have our American friends. Helmut Kohl would always speak about Europe or Europeans as a family. And he would end up saying, but as in, of course, you had the son that was a hard worker, and everybody knew who that was, the hard worker. Then you had other sons that enjoy life. And I, being Spanish, I was always thinking, am I this one or am I the next one? One like more drinking, the other one like more enjoying. But he always concluded we need to keep a room for the American friend. And for us, United States has been fundamental in this geopolitics, and especially the modern geopolitics. But as I said, I could stop here and say thank you and amen. But as Charles Rupnik has said, many of the things that I wanted to say, let me just make a more free-flowing remark. And my remark starts with the purpose of this conference. Where does Europe begin and end? You had your phone, I had my glasses. Where does Europe begin and end? I mean, frankly, what do we do about Troy and Pergamo? And what do we do about the Ponte tradition, European tradition there? And what do we do about Tsar Nicholas I calling the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe? And today, nobody would say Turkey is part of Europe. I have voiced and defended that a Ataturk Republican Turkey was in the interest of the European Union. We won't get into this debate, maybe during the debate, but today this is not seen. Why? Because of geopolitics. That's the short answer. When you see a demonstration tearing down the European Union flag from the official buildings in Kiev and saying we are not Europeans, what is this? This is geopolitics. Geopolitics is everywhere in the definition of Europe, has always been in the definition of Europe. If you allow, you said, well, it was clear from Herodotus on, it was clear that Europe in the south finished at the Pyrenees. You know, I grew up in Spain where in my school, the Lycée Français of Madrid, I lost one of my young teeth, fortunately, because I just fought as my French pupils would tell me, Spain, Europe, not at all. Europe finishes at the Pyrenees. At the Pyrenees, it's Africa that starts. So again, why? It was Franco and it was geopolitics. So geopolitics is at the core. And it is absolutely true what Charles Rupnik has said, that the European project was made to keep out geopolitics. I think that it was made just in a kind of general amnesia at anything that would create discomfort, and for cause, because the European Union project is born out of the idea of not having another bloodshed on European soil, a bloodshed mainly between France and Germany, but incorporating others that have been there regularly. I think that, Charles, we need also to reflect on this voluntary amnesia and what this has brought to us and to the way we see the world. Because my other comment is on the geopolitics looking inside. And you have hinted at something that we have to say. Where does Europe finish? Today we have the impression many times that Europe finishes in certain of our neighborhoods or in certain of places of the former Rust Belt in France, or in the rural areas, or with the old people in the case of Brexit. There is a divide there that we need to analyze, and you hinted at that, and I hope that we do. But there is this idea of where does Europe begin and end, just projects itself more generally. I think that one of these ideas, you always hinted at that, is this idea of the international and institutional world order. This is what we are about. This order that just speaks about rule of law, speaks about democracy, speaks about respect of human rights. And this institutional world order was built after 45 together with the United States. But today the United States are in a different route, more isolationist, not wanting to engage into this multilateral world. And we see aberrations, and allow me to say aberrations like seeing Xi Jinping at the World Economic Forum conference in Davos, just proclaiming himself the champion of the free economic world. Or the same Xi Jinping proclaiming himself in Marrakesh just the fighter for the world approach to climate change issues. This is not conducive to anything serious, and we need to understand as Europeans that this is part of our geopolitics, that we have to, from this core of the European Union, this is why the European Union has to be strong, and I hope that we will discuss strong inside, socially, we need strong in the borders, but I think that we also need us to think that there is something that has changed. Our discourse, that is this liberal world order or liberal democratic respect of human rights discourse, has until now been, in Aristotelian terms, has been rational, exposed with ethical lines. So we had logos, we had ethos, but we lacked pathos. And because politics is back, pathos is back. And unfortunately, pathos is much stronger by those that challenge this world order. So we have had Marine Le Pen calling the liberal order diabolique, and people follow her in an empathic movement. So these we have to pay attention, because, as you said, Emmanuel Macron did that, and did that with success and without just distancing himself from certain values, notably from European values. But he empathized with people. Yes, I think that we have, in rational terms, to see why people are disaffected, and maybe there is a component to be made what promises this liberal world order did not fulfill. But honestly, I think that this idea of empathy, this idea of just speaking to the hearts, not just to the heads, is absolutely necessary. This is, again, part. The discourse is not, it's not just the economy stupid, it's The economy, yes, of course, it is the economy, but it's politics, stupid. Let me wrap up by just going back to Havel. Havel mentioned this idea of values in politics in all works of life. And we are at this crucial moment where we are seeing hopeful signs that go from the ones that you have said to, honestly, we tend to forget. Spain. In Spain, 3 years ago, everybody would tell you that the next president of the government would be someone from Podemos. Well, you know what? It's Mariano Rajoy from the Partido Popular. So I think that this, what at certain moments, and you have mentioned Krastev, at certain moment, many of the best brains in Europe would see this as a kind of wave that was advancing and that was very difficult to stop. It's not the case. And again, behind all this, there are the values, and there is this idea of Europe as homeland of homelands, which is very Havelian. So thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I think both Jacques and Anna, summarize some of the reasons why we should not give in to defeatism in thinking about European perspective, that there are means and ways to defend the accomplishments of the European project so far, and maybe to expand on them. Just the same, we were still speaking largely about the EU, and if you look at the map, and if you remember the history of, let's say, 15 years ago, then the hopes that existed at the beginning of the century for the completion of the European project in both the geopolitical and the spiritual, sense have not yet materialized. I mean, it was a given at the beginning of century that the whole of Southern Europe, the whole of Balkans will eventually become a part of the Union. Has not materialized. We had high hopes for the Eastern Partnership, for bringing in Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova to the European sphere. Has not happened yet. There is this small matter of Turkey, which was at one time apparently on the way in. Now it is equally apparently on the way out, and Britain is also on the way out. And I'm not speaking about even more general projects of the Mediterranean Partnership and the European neighborhood policies that also contained high hopes for expanding on the project. But the world has not gone away. We still have to deal with what is around us and what is largely Europe as well as the European Union. And to discuss these questions, we have our panel composed of Vladimir Kara-murza, Pawel, Kowal, Vincuk, Viačorka, and Tebessüm, Yilmaz. And I will ask them to join us on the podium now, if they can. And Anna was right. We are a little late, but apparently there's so much food for thought that we will have less time for the real thing. So we may shorten the lunch a little, but I hope that none of you will mind. We'll start with Vladimir Kara-murza, who's the vice chairman of Open Russia and colleague and close collaborator of the late Boris Nemtsov, and still a very courageous activist for freedom and democracy under very difficult conditions in Russia. So, Vladimir, we will start with you, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I want to first of all thank our gracious hosts. This morning, the Václav Havel Library and the representation of the European Commission in Czech Republic, and Ambassador Michal Žantovský for holding this very important discussion. And as part of this discussion, for raising this question that has been certainly on the minds of Russian thinkers and Russian political leaders for many generations, the question of where Europe begins and ends. And what is the relationship between Russia and Europe, and what is the role and place of Russia in Europe. And the best answer to this that I know was given by eminent 19th century Russian philosopher and writer Vladimir Solovyov in one of his latest and his most important works, Three Discussions, in which he wrote, "The correct noun for the adjective Russian is European. We are Russian Europeans, just as there are English, French, or German Europeans. I am as European as surely as I am a Russian." This is what he wrote back at the end of the 19th century. Of course, this question of whether Russia belongs in Europe has been a source of contention and debate in Russian society for many years, between Slavophiles and Westernizers, between traditionalists and liberals, between supporters of autocracy and those who believe that the Russian people, just like any other people, deserves to live under a rule of law, with dignity, with civic freedoms and democratic elections. We know, of course, Vladimir Putin's answer to this question. In fact, the Kremlin was good enough to provide it in so many words. A few years ago, the Russian government, the Culture Ministry, produced an official document, a white paper, that outlined government strategy. And that white paper was titled, "Russia is not Europe." The current Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev, has publicly stated that European parliamentary democracy would be a, quote, catastrophe for Russia. And in all of its actions, both domestically and on the international stage, the current regime and the Kremlin is controverting every principle that is at the heart of the European system of values, whether when it imprisons political opponents, silences the media, falsifies elections, or when it tries to undermine the sovereignty of other countries and invades and annexes their territory. Of course, the domestic and the international behavior of the Kremlin are directly linked and directly related. A government that disregards its own laws and abuses the rights of its own citizens can hardly be expected to abide by international norms or to respect the interests of other countries. And in fact, the motivation for this aggressive behavior abroad is very often domestic, as was the case, for example, with Ukraine, with Mr. Putin's aggression against Ukraine that began 3 years ago. He really didn't enjoy the precedent of a corrupt authoritarian ruler fleeing from power, as thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were demonstrating on the streets of the capital city, and not just anywhere, but in a country so culturally and historically close to Russia as Ukraine. And he rightly, I think, estimated that a successful democratic European Ukraine would serve as an inspiration to many in Russia. And he felt that he had to prevent the success of the Maidan in Kiev before it would become a model for a Maidan in Moscow. Of course, as you can imagine, our answer to the question posed by the organizers of this conference is very different from Mr. Putin's. In one of his last interviews with Dosh television station in 2014, Boris Nemtsov was asked about what are the most fundamental differences between the Kremlin and the Russian democratic opposition. And he said, "We believe that Russia is a European country. We believe that Russia's civilizational choice is European." And of course it has been for a long time, not just in terms of culture, which goes without saying, and Russia has been an essential part of European culture for centuries, but also very often in terms of political development. It was the Tsar of Russia who signed the first European law granting suffrage to women for the Grand Duchy of Finland in 1906. Russia was one of the first countries in Europe whose parliament called for the abolition of the death penalty unanimously by a vote in June of 1906. Russia adopted universal suffrage 1 year before it was adopted in Germany. And every time Russian citizens had a choice in a more or less free election between an authoritarian option and a democratic option, they invariably chose a democratic one, whether in the first Duma elections in 1906, in the Constituent Assembly elections of 1917, or in the presidential elections in 1991. And just as domestic repression and external aggression have always gone hand in hand in Russia, so have the opposites. The strengthening of our European identity and more respect for political freedoms at home. This was certainly the case in the 1990s, when Russia rejoined the European family, becoming a full member of the Council of Europe and enshrining its principles and its commitments in Russian law. And it was, of course, a time when Russia had a democratically elected government and a vibrant independent media. It was also a time when Russian foreign policy was not revanchist. And President Yeltsin, for example, was instrumental in helping to secure the independence of the Baltic states. And publicly, as Russian head of state and as a matter of official policy, condemned prior Soviet aggression, including the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia. That European Russia is still there. It's not, of course, in the policies or pronouncements of Vladimir Putin or Sergei Lavrov. It's in the people all over the country who are becoming increasingly dismayed with the autocracy and the corruption and the sheer arrogance of that same small group that has been in power now for 17 years, almost a generation. It's in the people who are prepared to stand up for what they believe in and to go out into the streets and protest against the regime, despite the risks and the threats and the intimidation and the pressure, as we saw with the tens of thousands of people who went out to the streets across Russia just a few weeks ago at the end of March, and are planning to do so again in mid-June when the next wave of protest, nationwide protest, is planned. They are also the voices of Russia, and I would say much better and much more hopeful ones than Mr. Putin or Mr. Lavrov. Václav Havel once referred to the post-communist transformation in former Warsaw Pact countries as their return to Europe. Unlike others, Russia, of course, hasn't managed to return quite fully 25 years ago. But it will. Mr. Putin's regime is not forever. And I think it's very important that when political change starts happening in Russia, our friends and neighbors in Europe stand ready to welcome a future democratic Russia into your ranks. In his memorable speech in Mainz, West Germany, in May of 1989, US President George H.W. Bush famously said that our goal, our common goal, should be a Europe whole and free. In the years that have passed since that speech, the progress towards this goal has been remarkable. But we are not there yet. Because Europe will only be truly whole and truly free once Europe's two largest nations, Russia and Ukraine, take their rightful places in it. And I think when that day comes, that will be a very good day for all of us. Thank you very much again, Ambassador. It's an honor and pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Vladimir, for this strong and excellent pitch for a European Russia. And I think our thoughts and sympathies are with those in Russia who work towards that end. And of course, it puts some responsibility on us as well to help as much as we can. Our next speaker is European by the EU standards, Professor Pawel Kowal, and I will, to save time, I will not name all his important positions and functions, but he was a member of the European Parliament, of the Polish Parliament, Secretary of State at the Polish Foreign Ministry, a member of the Polish National Security Council. So,
thank you,
Professor Kowal.
Thanks a lot. The question of European borders is not very easy. Very common solution is to go, like my children, to YouTube and see some videos. And you will find in YouTube a few movies which in 3 or maximum 5 minutes show how the borders of Europe have changed over the last 1,000 years. Also the eastern borders. You will quickly come to the conclusion that in fact there is no sense to talk about geographical borders of Europe, Europe's borders in our concept do not have much in common with geography. It's a matter of politics and history. Above all, this is a question of our political vision, political imagination. It is important to talk about the shape of Europe as a part of the West. It means the legal and political structure and system of alliances. This is a conversation about Europe in which we grow up as we know it. This is a discussion about Europe. In fact, this is the discussion about Europe in second half of the 20th century. Let's collect the keywords. Human rights, law, respect for the law, opposition to totalitarianism, memory of the last war, especially memory of the Second World War, Holocaust, and European integration, NATO, and alliance with the US. Europe in shape as a part of West. We should add to that collection of keywords Yalta and enlargement after 1989. And the belief that the Central and Eastern Europe cannot remain a gray zone of security. Where's the border of this Europe? On the Odra River? On the Bug River? In the Urals? Caucasus? No. The border of this Europe is in human memory. The real border of our Europe, it's a memory. The memory about last century, shaping our imagination of the Europe. A few weeks ago, the organizers of the Summit of Europe in Rome has forgotten to invite a good father of the current shape of Europe, of the current Europe. It's George Bush. He supported European integration. The condition of German unification was the Treaty of Maastricht. The distance between reunification of Germany and Treaty of Maastricht, it's only 69 days. Bush supported European integration. The second condition of reunification of Germany was the opening of Western structures to the East, to the Central Europe. It was one of main elements of the same declaration of Bush when he declared the common one Europe. And he understood that leaving Central Europe alone lead to war. Memory. Our memory is only seemingly continuous. In Poland, last 10 years, more than 60 historical museums have been established in the last decade, only one decade. Historians have written books about history. Filmmakers, directors are making films about history. And we put the question how to protect real human memory. But we historians know that living memory, it's only last 3 generations. It's not more time, in fact. If something was before, it became, also in museums, in films, in books, something unreal, like a myth. Europe, as we know, open Europe, has such boundaries and such political shape in our imagination because World War II, because totalitarianism, because of communism, because of solidarity, because Havel, Valenza, etc., etc. And current answer for that. What Europe threatens us? The problem is Europe without that real contact with history. Europe without real contact with our history, our personal history, with history of our nations, and in consequence, without memory and without shape, without borders. For example, small Europe, double-speed Europe. This is Europe without memory. Rich people want to build a small, rich Europe, closed, as a city in the Middle Ages, in choleric epidemic times. City walled and moat with water. Nationalists say, we want to close our markets. It could be better for our nations. We want to close our borders. Marine Le Pen, in private meeting with one of important European politicians, confesses, for France, it would be good to go back to the 30s on the last century. Instead of real memory, playing role the sentiments. Instead of history, we have myths, fairy tales, she tells fibs. Europe is losing memory and is losing its borders. Let's summarize. History, memory, geopolitics also, self-identity, borders. Lord Dahrendorf once said in one interview, "A happy country does not agree about the future, but it's basically in agreement about the past." In an unhappy country, the reverse is true. In this sense, Europe is still far from being a happy country. He is understanding their own borders and shape. Europe is losing memory. Thank you.
Thank you.
Because you haven't been mic'd.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Kowal, for reminding us that Europe is something that extends not only in space but also in time, and of the role, indispensable role of memory in staying European. Our next speaker, Vincuk Viačorka, has for more than 30 years been one of the foremost democracy activists, human rights fighters and leaders of the democratic opposition in Belarus. He's one of the founders and the former chairman of the Belarusian Popular Front, and a very brave opponent of the current regime in the country. We met, I think it was in 2000, at a demonstration commemorating the anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster in Minsk, and I've been a great admirer of Vincuk ever since. Vincuk, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Indeed, Michael Žantovský did not hesitate to come to Minsk in dangerous times, to a dangerous event, because the solidarity is something indivisible from the line from the set of our European values. The letter, maybe one of the last letters written by Václav Havel, was sent to Ales Bielatsky, the human rights defender, who was imprisoned for a long term. And we know that it was much easier for him to survive this imprisonment. So that solidarity and to add what the memories should be kept in our hearts as marks of Europeanism, I would like to mention the revolutions of the end of 80s, beginning of 90s, the fresh air of which was crucially important for returning of Central and partly Eastern European nations to this common European space. In Belarus, now the word Europe is polysemantic. Every Belarusian would proudly show you the Iron Monument marking the center of Europe, geographical center of Europe, between the Atlantic Ocean and Ural Mountains. But the same would proudly be done by Lithuanian, Pole, Ukrainian, whoever else. There is a lot of such marks of the center of Europe. Our nations compete of them. On the other hand, it is the common phrase in Belarus, "Я съездил в Европу," I visited Europe. This means I was in Poland, Lithuania, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Germany, European Union. So that the European project coincides now to much extent in the consciousness of my compatriots with the European Union. We went to Europe is something parallelly existing with the understanding that we are Europe ourselves. Historically, you may guess that I defend traditional Europeanism of Belarusians as people, as a nation. Historically, we belonged to all the main European trends. We've had city self-governments. You may see the city halls or their remnants in Belarus cities, which survived Tsarist or Soviet periods. Our people are law-abide. This feature is perfectly used by the dictators or authoritarian leaders. But they do not tolerate the real historical memory and real national identity of Belarusians, replacing it with the Soviet identity. That was the dream of Lukashenko, the creation of the last isle of Homo Sovieticus, the small but proud state of Homo Sovieticus. But this project finally failed. The youngest generation does not share the Soviet values, the statism, and what I want to bring to this audience, to everywhere in Europe, it is the deep difference between the state policy, the policy of leadership of Belarus, and the real moods, trends, and prospects of Belarus society, especially its younger and youngest part. The geopolitics in Belarus has its very concrete dimension. I mean the attitude to such authoritarian leaders like Lukashenko or Aliyev or Yanukovych in his times as instruments to keep the countries ruled by them out of Russian influence, as an instrument to save the independent statehoods of these nations from the catastrophe, from the disaster. The recent developments, recent events in international communication, international policy towards Belarus is the good illustration of this new-old approach, of this understanding. There is a good German word, Verstehers, those who understand the dictators, the authoritarian leaders, understand their psychology. Minsk enjoys a series of visits of European politicians, including politicians of Central Europe. Some of them express their sympathy to the leaders. Some of them call Mr. Lukashenko a very warm person. Nevertheless, we can't say that the independence of Belarus is now guaranteed by Lukashenko's system of power, by the authoritarian system of power. There is a systemic contradiction in what we have now. Such regimes like in Minsk cannot survive without suppression, destruction of genuine civil society, of independent political parties and movements, without suppression, arrests, persecution of bright political leaders. In addition, and this is a specific feature of Belarus, this regime, which had built its identity and its mission on Soviet remnants, on Soviet nostalgia, and this way destroyed all the historical memory, now can't turn its propaganda and information line to other side. It can't strengthen the national identity of Belarusians as Eastern European nation of middle size. So that the danger coming every day from Russian political, information, economic, military space cannot be stopped by the regime. On the other hand, that's interesting, and this is the source of my optimism. We have so-called obligatory TV set, cheap or even almost for free, available in every household. 8 TV channels. 4 of them are Russian TV channels. NTV, ORT, all these sources of harsh propaganda. And its anchors like Solovyov or Kiselyov. Despite this, according to last polls, unfortunately after year 2015 we have no reliable polls because of repression against the last opinion poll agencies. Less than half of Belarusians share the approaches to recent events, to Russian-Ukrainian war and so on, coming from these TV sets. There is an interesting comparison of general index of this influence of the 15th year. About 78–80% of Russians share these, let's say, imperialistic attitudes. First of all, to Russian-Ukrainian war. About 20% 2 years ago of Ukrainians. I suppose now this percentage is much lower. Percentage of Belarusians is in the medium, 40-something%. And what is the most interesting, and this is the most striking difference between Belarusian society and Russian society, as I feel it, I don't know how Vladimir perceives this, Belarusians, okay, they can agree that in Crimea there was a historical problem, who knows who is right, maybe Russians are right, maybe Ukrainians are right, but we definitely don't want to defend Russia and to participate on the side of empire in all these conflicts. So that when you hear from Lukashenko that he stays apart from the conflict, even such kind of authoritarian leaders are forced to listen to real public moods. They cannot ignore them totally. So that I think that the best way for Western politicians who think about bright future of Europe, and I first of all think about institutionalized Europe, because in our case, if no Russia, so what? Divided Europe. It is very, very bad alternative for us. It frustrates the pro-European, pro-Western, and pro-independence forces in our country. But those Western leaders who try to play games with such leaders as Lukashenko, who believe in re-educating them, should take into account the Belarus people, who is the only real guarantor of Belarus independence. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think you made. Thank you so much, Vincuk. I think you made the stark choice that is in front of Belarus quite clear, and it is unfortunately true that some European politicians apparently confuse foreign policy with psychotherapy or social work. It has never worked very well, and I doubt it will in this particular instance. Now, in this country, we still give, on social occasions, we still give precedence to ladies and do not think of it as sexist. And so I don't know how it happened that our last speaker on this panel is a lady. Tebessüm Yilmaz is a Turkish social activist and political activist. She's an academician too, and she's active in the defense of persecuted students and women in the Kurdish areas of Turkey and in other respects. So the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much. Since January 2016, I have been attending debates, discussions, roundtables, and solidarity gatherings quite regularly as a speaker, and unfortunately, I have gotten into a rut. All these events are bound together by the same issue, contemporary Turkish politics as seen by an academic and activist. Let me share my thoughts with you on how this event fits right into this experience. Please don't get me wrong, and no offense, I'm a political scientist, but I'm having a hard time speaking about the geopolitics of Europe and Turkey, or giving an answer to the question whether Turkey is European or not. And it's just because I feel that I'm avoiding something very fundamental. This fundamental thing actually is a problem, an issue. Most debates concerning the Academics for Peace initiative are founded upon victim narratives. Yes, the signatories of last year's petition have endured a lot of pressure from the Turkish state. Yes, my friends and I and colleagues have been sacked from their jobs, they have been threatened through social media and attacked in person, their passports have been cancelled, and they have been imprisoned. In overall, more than 100,000 public servants were banned from public service for a lifetime and sacked from their positions. Their passports also have been cancelled. More than 3,000 students are in prison right now. Yet, this sadly overshadows the original reason why we had come together. In 2015, when the so-called peace process failed, a war that could have been avoided was stirred up. Seeing the brutal force of the Turkish security forces, we couldn't stay silent, and we said that we would not be a party to this crime. Though, when I emphasize this, the massacres, the displacement, and the renewed hatred against the Kurds of Turkey, but importantly, also the acts of resistance. Debates quickly take a step back, and talking about the war is quickly skipped. What stays is the narrative about two groups of victims, the academics as new victims and the Kurds as the eternal ones. Omitting that, it would be silly to draw a clear line between Kurds and academics. How many of the signatories are both? We are not recognized as subjects with agency. Rather, we are just seen as objects on the receiving end. As a result, we are being invited over and over by the same organizations to talk about the same unchanging topics. This then turns valuable discussions that we need to have into charity events that have no further long-term effect. An issue that we as signatories also haven't reflected on enough is that agency is a spectrum. If both the Academics for Peace and the Kurds are denied their agency, it doesn't mean that in the hierarchy we will be in the same position. This shows best in the question of believability. The HDP MP, Faysal Sarıyıldız, has been a frequent guest in one-day conferences of the European Parliament, and he has been talking about the war in the Kurdish southeast over and over again. Last year, in January, Mehmet Tunç, a Kurdish politician from Cizre, managed to reach an international conference on the European Parliament. He gave a first-hand account of the horrors he and others were facing during the siege of Cizre. Tunç later burned to death in the basement he had been hiding in with many others. The media impact of these first-hand accounts in comparison with the coverage of our petition shows how little credibility is given to Kurdish actors from Turkey. On the other hand, these events show that action can be taken. I wish it were not only single MPs organizing these sessions, and I can only hope that parties like the German Die Linke won't be alone in taking legislative action with direct impact, such as fighting for arms trade embargoes. This March, the UN finally published a report on the war in Turkey. According to it, up to 5,000 locals were displaced. Around 1,500 people were killed, and a lot more than that were injured. It also doesn't omit the full-scale destruction of cities like Cizre and Şırnak and the massacres in which people like Mehmet Tunç died. The relations between the European states and Turkey and the relations between their citizens are deeply damaged by persistent victimization. To have an open dialogue, I call on you to listen carefully to what people from Turkey have to say. Just like in Russia, there are thousands of people demonstrating on the streets. They are resisting and they are fighting for democracy. Most importantly, see what action they can make with your support. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you so much, Tebessüm. You just reminded us that geopolitics may sound like a dry subject, but there is the human experience of politics and geopolitics, and I think we should never forget for 1 second that Václav Havel believed as a crucial part of our European identity in the co-responsibility of every human being for what happens to other human beings in other parts of the world, and never failed to raise his voice when their rights were abused, when they were persecuted, when they were being killed and tortured. And I think the least we can do is to follow that example. Now, we have made up a little time, and since it is an integral part of these dialogues, it is now the opportunity for you, our audience, to speak, ask questions of the speakers, or for the speakers to exchange views between the panelists. But we have the first question back there. And would you please introduce yourself?
There's a problem with microphone.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm Valeria Karableva, Kyiv University. Thanks to all of you. I have a special question to Mr. Kara-murza. First of all, thank you for affirming with your presence the existence of another European Russia. But I wonder what symbolic boundaries for this Russia you see, because obviously that Europe of today is a Europe of nation states. And all former European empires, but Russia fell apart, giving way to modern nation states. And I think that it's a great challenge for Russia to reimagine itself in this way. So how do you envision it? Is it a sort of divisive issue for Russian liberals? Because I'm not talking only about the Crimea, but also some internal issues like Chechnya, Siberia, Tatarstan, and the like. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very important and very fundamental question. And we just had we began this discussion last night of what kind of borders Europe has and where do they lie. And there are all these definitions, and they have changed over time, of course. As Anna said, Spain was once considered not Europe, and Russia was once considered not Europe. Now, of course, both are clearly Europe. But I think I agree with what Pawel said, and that's the borders of Europe are not primarily on the map, but they're in the minds. And in that sense, I think culturally and in terms of mentality, the borders of Europe are what the founders of the OSCE declared it to be from Lisbon to Vladivostok. I mean, of course, by no stretch can Vladivostok or Irkutsk be considered European geographically. I think the Ural Mountains is by now the accepted eastern border of Europe. But in terms of the common mental and common cultural space, it certainly is so. I mean, I go all over Russia these days in my capacity as Vice Chairman of Open Russia. We have more than 25 national chapters, regional chapters across the country. And one of our most active chapters is in Irkutsk on Lake Baikal, and that, again, is in no way European.
This is a real European city.
Yeah. Absolutely, but when I'm there, I mean, I feel like I am in Europe. And it's only a few dozen kilometers to the Chinese border, and it's on Lake Baikal. But mentally, in terms of just looking around, the architecture, the people, it is Europe. So I think when that day finally comes, when Russia fully rejoins the European family, which I'm absolutely certain that day will come, I think the borders of Europe, cultural, mental, and political Europe will stretch from Lisbon to Vladivostok, and I think that's the way it should be.
I may just add one. What you were saying, Vladimir, believe it or not, is just a beautiful paragraph of Salvador de Madariaga, another of the great Europeans, that he says exactly, you know, when I'm in a city, and I don't want to, I mean, I walk in the city and I know if I'm in Europe or not. And this may be, and he mentioned cities all over Europe, and there is something that tells you you are in Europe. I think that this is the translation of culture. And what I wanted to say is that this debate about the borders of Europe, the borders that are not cultural, are not values, which are, in my opinion, the big borders. These are the borders. And this is why we have internal borders. The people that vote for nationalist, extremist, these are also our marque. We have to reconquer this as well. And these are the true marque of Europe, the true frontier territory of Europe. But I would like to add that the importance of the limits, the borders, until where is because of the European Union. Because before that, historically, the European concept has changed with geopolitics. But there was this idea of Europe that was there that was more in values. It was because of joining the Union and who could be candidate and who could not be candidate. Now, we are at a moment where the European Union is redefining itself. And with this redefinition, we need to think and we need to be present to bring on board this other approach. Not that I defend today that enlargement is out forever at all. Honestly, I think that there are clear candidates out there. Russia in the internal market, I'm not sure. I think that this is open for the future. So Russia it's open for the future because we are in a new world. And this is clear. This is a new uncharted world. We need to navigate just at sight, but navigation at sight means that you have to have very strong principles and very strong values. And as for the rest, let's just understand that this obsession with limits was the obsession with enlargement, and the obsession with enlargement today doesn't really make sense. We have to rethink the European project. The European project, I hope it goes forward. It will have a core built not on the market, which was always what defined the internal market, but built on the euro. And this will be the core if the project is to go forward. And then in the day of today, you know what? I personally think that we need to defend, because of values and because of this is important, that, you know, from Atlantic to Vladivostok, of course, and to say that not Turkey today, but a certain idea of Turkey is absolutely part of this European project. This is because if not, we have to start bringing other walls and Turkey cannot be there because of Muslim religion. I don't think so. I think that it's we need to strongly fight for that.
Thank you. I think we have time for another question, please.
So, I'm Chris Herdell. I was last year. I had a conference in Odessa, in Ukraine, southern Ukraine, and I was quite amazed to see the situation there, which is that very few people speak Ukrainian. And most of them speak Russian. And for instance, in the universities, professors are supposed to speak Ukrainian, but they refuse, they speak Russian. The students speak Russian and they don't want to hear about Poroshenko and so on. It means that the overall, yes, they are anti-Poroshenko regime, absolutely. The mayor is a pro-Russian. The mayor-elect is a pro-Russian guy. So the point is that these people are they are Russian with a Ukrainian passport. Yeah, and this narrative, you don't get it in Western media, and that's my point. Yeah, if media are so one-sided, if you have to go by yourself to a place like Odessa to find out about the reality there, something is very, very wrong. And we cannot build Europe on the base of lies of media, lies of clans and cliques. And I would maybe concretely ask, so Odessa was, by the way, Europe. Odessa is Europe. It was founded by a nobleman of Spanish blood, Derribas, who was born in Naples, in Italy, and who worked for Catherine the Great, and he founded around 1800 Odessa. So that is Europe. So don't bring the wars in Europe. Are the wars of the cliques and the clans, the elites, the nomenclatures. This is the people are not interested in wars. And this is the first thing is we have to stop the conflict with Russia, because if there is a hot conflict in Europe, it will be for us and not for the Americans. The second thing is my question to you concretely. I'm always waiting for from the Polish side, let's say a mea culpa. A mea culpa of the nationalist Poland of the 20th century. The first Holocaust was not by Hitler; it was by you people in after 1918, 1920 in the western part of Ukraine, where Poland, the national Poland, took over huge territories up to Minsk, and this was one of the sources why Stalin joined Hitler, because they wanted to get back to take back these huge territories. So we have to, on the table should be now the truth, the historical truth, and also the truth of the today's reality, and not some myth which is suiting well certain elites. Thank you very much.
Professor Kowal, would you like to comment on that question?
Especially to the especially to the first part of question, because I suppose that I didn't understand the question about Holocaust in Poland before Second World War. This is a kind of misunderstanding, I think, and I think that more serious it would be answer for the first part of question or your conclusion. I think that we should understand that in Ukraine we can observe a few parallel processes. The first one is modernization. The second one is Europeization. If I say in that context Europeization, I mean the question of DCFTA. This is kind of Magdeburg law in our times. This is a process of unification of legal base between Ukraine and European Union. This is a very important process in context of the main the main topic of our conference. And parallel, we can observe the process of unification of the country. Because this is the first time in history when Ukraine can develop in that shape. Ukraine is the mix of many political culture. Yes, this is one nation and political nation with many minorities and many, not two political culture, not West and East. It's another tradition of political tradition, cultural tradition of Volhynia, another tradition is Galicia, Central Ukraine, Crimea, East Ukraine, Donbass. This is the same process like unification in history of Western Europe, like unification of Germany or Italy. Mm-hmm. We should understand that in Ukraine we can observe a few parallel processes. This is much more complicated because this is much more complicated than, for example, if we compare, for example, with Polish or Czech transformation. This is a point. And I'm sorry, I didn't understand your general question about, my apologize on behalf of Poland about any Holocaust.
Right.
Question of, I think, a basic fact. Yeah. Thank you.
And on the first question, I think that few people in this room would dispute that Odessa is a great cosmopolitan maritime city with Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, with a very strong Jewish legacy.
By the way, this is very European city.
and very European, and that it is a part of Ukraine.
Well, we have. Thank you, Ambassador. I want to comment also on, if I may, on the first part of your question, which is very important, and I'm glad you raised this point. Of course, it doesn't come as news to us in Russia that a large part of Ukraine and a lot of Ukrainians speak Russian as a first language. That not just in Odessa. If you go to Kiev, you're more likely to hear Russian on the streets than Ukrainian, and that's normal, and that's been the pattern for many years, and that is precisely why Mr. Putin was so afraid of both the first Maidan in 2004. And the second one in 2013 and 2014, because it's a mentality question. So what we were talking about a minute ago, a democratic Estonia or democratic Latvia or even a democratic Czech Republic, it doesn't really serve as a direct example for Russia. A democratic Ukraine certainly does, because it's a country so close culturally, linguistically, in terms of religion, in terms of just common history for so many centuries. And so this is why Putin was so afraid of this, and this is why he set out to destabilize and try to prevent the success and do all he can to try to make sure this doesn't work, which he has been doing for more than 3 years now. And this is also why, by the way, many Russian activists and Russian opposition leaders supported the Maidan in Ukraine, both in 2004 and 2014. In the Orange Revolution, Boris Nemtsov, the leader of the Russian opposition, was there on the Maidan together with the leaders of the Ukrainian Orange forces. So there's this rapport also for many years going between the Russian democratic forces and Ukrainian democratic forces. So it's a very important point, and it's, of course, completely contrary to the oversimplified caricature image presented by Kremlin propaganda that there are some kind of Banderovite fascists who are persecuting Russians. It's complete nonsense, and it's very important to refute that. And the fact that a successful democratic Ukraine would encompass both the Ukrainian and the Russian culture within it is very important. And also, of course, some of the biggest independent media in the Russian language in the world are now in Ukraine, just because we have almost no independent media left in our country, because all the main national TV channels have long been taken over by the Kremlin and so on. So, a successful Ukraine with both Ukrainian and Russian component would be very important. And I would just say again that it's now 28 years since George Bush Sr.'s Mind speech. And that goal of Europe whole and free is still not achieved, because, and we were also talking about this last night, the two largest countries in Europe are Russia and Ukraine, just simply in terms of size. These are the two largest European countries, and they're both still outside of that Europe whole and free, speaking politically. So I think it's all of our goal should continue to be striving towards achieving that Europe whole and free, and that will only be possible once Ukraine and Russia are in.
Thank you. And I'm afraid we will have to stop at this. We are now only 20 minutes late, so we have time for a quick coffee. If we can make it in 10 minutes, it would be wonderful. And let me thank Anna Palacio, Vladimir, Kara-murza, Pawel, Kowal, Vincuk, Viačorka, and Tebessüm, Yilmaz for their wonderful contributions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thanks a lot.